I'm the lucky one. It's me and these three fine gentlemen. This panel has gone through a number of iterations, and it's finally ended up like this. The cue that we were given, the panel is called Matters of Faith, and the cue that we were given to think about is if or how our identities, our religious identities, impinge on the work that we do. So I'm going to get started and just tell you a little bit about myself, and then each of the gentlemen will do that as well. We'll pick up a couple of ideas that we want to play with, we'll talk, and towards the end of the session, we'll include you in our conversation. All right, so I thought that because the cue that we were given revolves around identity, I thought it was quite important that we define ourselves rather than me say, this is Kalyan and this is what he does. So my name is Arshia. I work with classical Hindu texts, I work with epic, and I work with mythology. I work with the Ramayana, which has become increasingly, in the last century, the central text of modern Hinduism, of the Hinduism that we now live with. I'm not a Hindu. Increasingly, other people point out to me that I'm Muslim. I'm not. My parents are. I grew up in the first story I remember hearing in my entire life is the Ramayana. So I feel like I've grown up with Ramayana. It belongs to me as much as it does to any other Indian. But it disturbs me terribly that people say, oh, you are a Muslim. And I'm like, you know what? Actually, I'm not. And you don't have the right to say that to me. But I realize that if that's how people are seeing me, then I've got to stand up and say, yeah, okay, count me, yeah? So in that sense, I feel that who I am as a religious identity has very little to do with the work that I do, which is work on the major text of another religion, a religion that I have grown up with, but not in. Conversely, I think it's very, very important for myself as a feminist. Yeah, that is an identity that I do want reflected in my work. And so I'm finding that that's something I need to negotiate with greater and greater honesty, which is not always easy when you're dealing with a patriarchal text that is 2,500 years old, because the text is still the text, and you are who you are, and how do you deal with a text that actually goes against the grain of your being? So that's my statement for me and my work. Kalyan?
Good morning on a Sunday. My parents were born Brahmins, and they are and remain in their 90s complete zealots. They're displaced from what has now become Bangladesh. They refuse to think of me as a Hindu. I am sort of being cast out of the family, so to speak. Although I have to say that my grandfather, who was a Tibetan scholar, and by birth a Hindu, never practiced Hinduism. My parents do, for some strange reason. You know, my grandfather and my father, there was a huge gap, generational gap between them and between my parents' generation and mine. Part of it was the problem of the partition. And although my grandfather saw through it, you know, saw the family through it without being psychologically damaged to the extent that my parents were, my mother lost a child. She's convinced that the child that she lost is me, come back. That's the extent of the damage in the crossing over from what became East Pakistan and later Bangladesh into India. In any case, in my studies, it was odd that it was simply, I thought everybody in the world learned Sanskrit because my grandfather taught me Sanskrit. He also taught me the alphabet of 3 other languages. I thought this was perfectly natural. And later when I wrote part of a book on comparative theology, the section on Hinduism that I wrote, I researched and found that the very word puja is not a Sanskrit word at all. The worship, it's a Dravidian word which was taken into the orthopraxy of Hinduism later, and so much of Hindu beliefs were simply not Aryan beliefs, which all Hindus want to identify with. So it was a polyglot polyglot religion in the first place. It was a mixture, as all religions are, subsuming things from previous religions, refusing to accept things from other religions after that, and so forth. My point is that my life was profoundly influenced by these conflicts in my own home, and in my novels I have written about these matters. My father threw away 3 copies of my novel before he came to the last 1/3, at which point he refused to read it because it offended his senses so very much. So you see, this is a continuing matter of conflict as we go on. For example, in my last novel, No Country, it deals with Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism and how that stopped the English from helping the Irish, and then how the Irish came to India, so many of them. But I don't want to hold forth because we were given 4 minutes each, so I will let you take on Brian and David. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Brian Catlos. I'm a historian, and my field of interest is Muslim, Christian, and Jewish relations in the Middle Ages. And much of what my work revolves around is I'm interested in how people use religious identity and under what circumstances religious identity becomes what we might say the sort of the primary means by which people identify themselves, right? How societies that are cosmopolitan and mixed can suddenly tip over into societies that are divided along religious lines. If you want to think of a modern example, you could think of Yugoslavia, post-Tito Yugoslavia, which in many ways was this society which seemed to be very at ease with its religious and ethnic diversity. But somehow, within a very short period, things snapped, and people came to identify themselves, or say that they were identifying themselves primarily along ethnic and religious terms, and this led to, of course, this terrible episode of violence, this war in Yugoslavia. So much of what my work consists of in the Middle Ages is really trying to get behind the religious rhetoric and see what sorts of factors are influencing the way people approach each other, whether in collaboration or conflict, and under what circumstances they raise that wall between each other. For the purposes of personal disclosure, which this panel is about as well, I guess I should say something about my perspective. And the perspective that I bring to it is, and this is a perspective which is not unproblematic, is of a non-believer. I don't identify with Christianity, Judaism, or Islam on a personal level. I was brought up as a Protestant in Canada, but that's not I feel no affinity or affiliation to Christianity in terms of religion. But one of the things I learned over the course of my research and my travels was that as writers, as historians, as people, we have to realize that our own conceptions of what constitutes religion and religious faith and religious community is very much tied to our own society. And I'll just illustrate that with a short anecdote before I pass on the microphone. Many years ago, in the early 1990s, after I finished my BA, I went to the Middle East. My plan was to learn Arabic and Hebrew. And I went to Syria, and it was the first time I had traveled in the Middle East, in a country and a society which was defined in part by religious identity. And I was traveling around quite innocently, and people would ask me in different circumstances when they met me. They were very curious about foreigners because no one was traveling in Syria at that time. They would ask me, "What religion are you?" And I would answer, "I'm an atheist," which of course is the most horrible, offensive thing to say in this circumstance. And gradually I realized that what they were asking me wasn't what my personal belief was, but rather which community I belonged to, so that they could assess how to interact with me, not necessarily in a negative way. If I said I was Christian, which is what I did after a while, right? Because I wasn't Muslim, so by default I became a Christian. It was just so they would know the limits of our relationship and be able to approach me with what was considered to be propriety. I never encountered bigotry. And for me, that was really illuminating, because it showed me, and this is something I think we've lost in our society, where we can sort of plug in our religion into our identity, and it really doesn't have any larger social implications. Usually it doesn't. And that's something quite different from the way religious identity and community is viewed in much of the rest of the world and for much of the rest of history. The way we approach it here is really exceptional, for good or for bad. And I think it's important to remember that when we look at other cultures and societies.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I guess we're setting context. My name is David Germano, and I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about the stages of my life and then how it relates to my thinking these days about religion and literature. So I think of myself as having 4 stages, and the first stage was very bound up with literature. I grew up in a very flat place in northern Indiana, about a mile south of Notre Dame. And I grew up in what I called an IC squared family, which means Irish, Italian, Catholic. And to the eternal regret of my Italian father, religion never took. And so I was baptized, confirmed, etc., but somehow it never made much sense to me. And so after that, in my 20s, I moved on to Buddhism, and I spent a lot of my life in Asia, about 13 years or so in different parts of Asia, India, Nepal, and mostly in Tibet. And for those years, I was studying Buddhist philosophy and meditation and just kind of immersing myself in these different religious communities, hermitages, monasteries, and so forth. And then I moved on to the University of Virginia, where I took a job a long time ago. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been deeply involved with community engagement work in Tibet and thinking about the way in which we talk a lot about Tibet and the plight of Tibet and so forth, but people often don't really understand that Tibet is not simply Buddhism. Tibet is a complex world, and I spent a lot of my life thinking about what does it mean for a community to be vital or to be sick in terms of its cultural well-being and so on. And then finally, the last 4 years or so, I've led a very big initiative at the University of Virginia exploring contemplation in various kinds of sectors. And one of the things that strikes me in this rich expansion of mindfulness and yoga and contemplation in North America has been what's missing is the kind of imaginative, articulated expression of the worlds in which we live or we might live, which is so bound up with a kind of literary practice. And so in this context, when I've been thinking the last day or so, sitting here at the Jaipur Literary Festival and listening to everyone and thinking about what we would talk about today, it seems to me that from my experience, it's very difficult to separate the things that we take for granted when we do literary festivals and think about literature in a modern context. One is the separation of literary genres. In my experience, they all live together. One text ranges across narrative and poetry and technical manual and philosophy and kind of fiction, imagination, poetry, etc. And it's one text. Or if it's not one text, it's an anthology. The importance of anthologies in historical and modern Tibetan literature is so important. Number 2, to separate literature from philosophy from practice, absolutely impossible. It's not a possible thing in the worlds that I live in the worlds that I explore. And we take that for such granted, these kind of separations. It's really hard to understand sometimes. We talked a little bit yesterday about the separation of the graphic and the oral, another impossible distinction. I'm involved with a very large project in Bhutan documenting oral and embodied knowledge, and which is going out like a light in Bhutan, as in so many other places around the world. So that complexity. And then finally, of the relationship of a text and a life, one of the reasons I left behind literature a long time ago and went to Buddhism with many delusions about Buddhism, but I didn't have those delusions about literature, so it seemed to make sense. The relationship of text and life. And then finally, the relationship of text and world, something I think about so much when we look at religious text. We have to understand the religious worlds in which they're embedded. So those are the kinds of things I've been thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you all for being so so honest and so revealing of yourselves. And I think it's a little bit unusual at a literature festival that we should speak so personally about the work that we do and how we locate ourselves in terms of the work that we do. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things, a little bit from David and a little bit from what Brian and I were talking about a little bit earlier, and I think the two are related. I think David is reminding us that we don't need to be separated from our work in the way Western secularism encourages us to be. And Brian and I were talking earlier also about the separation of self and work, religion and self, practice. I should say practice rather than religion. Practice and self, practice and work is something very new. It wasn't always the case. Yeah, there was a time when one wrote through oneself to one's work. Yeah, that it was very important who you were to be doing the work that you did. And typically in I don't want to use the word traditional societies because I think that's a cliche that traps particular kinds of thinking and encourages us to receive that kind of thinking as like, oh, different, which it is. But in societies where religion has a more public role and a more active role in the imagination, we did write through our religions to our own work. So I'd like you all to comment on that. Kalyan, will you start? Because you were talking a lot about being some kind of Hindu in like a more Hindu family.
Only by birth,
right,
and by accident of birth, one might say. Whereas I said that my grandfather, who was basically a Tibetan scholar, really gave it very little importance. But I'm reminded of a story of the time when Mahatma Gandhi's son, Ramlal, the endless son, he had a very troubled relationship with his father. Several plays have been written about the father and son relationship. He converted to Islam, and some people came to him and very derisively asked the Mahatma, what do you think now? Is it now a good thing that your son has become a Muslim? And Gandhi, the Mahatma, sort of smiled and simply said, you know, somebody's religion is only as good as his actions. What your religion is what your actions are. It's no matter saying, I belong to this religion or that religion. It's a matter, I mean, I think it's a kind of idiolect. It's individually that space that it occupies in our heads and make us do certain things. So, in that context, you know, the consciousness of what religion is and how others perceive us is also a very sort of interesting thing, sometimes a tragic thing. Let me give you another story, because I'm a storyteller.
Aren't we all at the Literature Festival?
My grandfather told me about the time when, during the partition, you know, there was this huge exchange of population, and one of his very close friends was this Jewish man who was, his name was Ephraim Zechariah in Bengali. And they were all crossing, and Ephraim was simply crossing because he had a business in Calcutta, and he was crossing from East Pakistan, or what became East Pakistan, to Calcutta. They were all stopped by Hindus. These were zealot Hindus who made everybody, all the males, drop their pants to see if you're circumcised or not. Zechariah, who was Jewish, was circumcised. My grandfather tried to explain to these people that he was Jewish, and of course he was circumcised. And these people who had never heard of Judaism in that part of India said, what are Jews? And they looked at each other and said, oh, it must be some kind of Muslim, and went out and, don't laugh, they slaughtered him. They killed him. Ignorance is a religion, and sometimes ignorance forms a kind of a platform from which to act. And one's religion can become that, or one's lack of religion can become that. And I've seen both parts of this in action, tragically, in India and internationally.
Yeah, just say something before bringing Brian into the conversation. The great conflicts of our times, yeah, whether it's the Middle East or, you know, Hindus and Muslims in the subcontinent, they're basically about land, who should live where. So they don't start as religious conflicts, but once God enters the picture, he never leaves, you know, and then it's always about him. But anyway, that was just to address this idea of, like, you know, who knows what, how...
Our notions of God enter into this.
All right, okay. A final point. Brian, sorry.
Well, writing through religion, in terms of history, I would say that in what we might call what we usually call the West, but which I prefer to call the Anglo-European world, I think that historians have quite unreflectingly been writing through their religion through most of the sort of post-Enlightenment exercise of the writing of history, except that they did so with such a self-assurance and a blind confidence in their own perspective that they imagined this as being objective. Nowadays, I think the academic culture has changed. I think that academic culture in general has become much more agnostic or atheistic, materialist, etc. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, this is really the position that I suppose I'm writing from, and sometimes I wonder if one is not careful, if that begins to present itself in effect as a religion also, but a religion in which the first tenet is the absence of God, but which in a functional way exercises the same sort of potential distortion on one's view of the present and the past as any religion did. And so part of the challenge, I think, is for someone who's writing about these things is to be constantly self-critical and be aware that objectivity, if it exists, and I don't think it does, is quite elusive. And so one also always has to be conscious of one's own biases and what one is leaving out, and one can't pretend that religion isn't in the room, because in one form or another, it seems that it always is.
That's an excellent point, Brian. Thank you so very much for pointing out that historians tend to be rational humanists for the most part and claim that that's not a position, that is in fact objective. We can argue about whether rational humanism is a religion or not, but the fact that everything is written from a position and from a perspective, sometimes we call it religious, and that agitates us terribly. But somehow if it's liberal or secular, it's like, oh, that's fine. And this is something that we're going through in India. It's very contested in India at the moment. Our histories are being rewritten. The liberal left, of which I'm one, very, very anxious that our histories are being Hinduized. Muslim rulers are being left out, roads are being renamed, if you know they're named for Mughals. But it's forcing people like myself, the liberal left, to also acknowledge the kinds of histories that we've been writing for the last century or so. And it would be fantastic if the histories were not in conflict, whether we saw that we should rather see them as talking to each other and enriching our idea of the past rather than contesting it or competing for ownership of the past. David?
So I'm a very late addition to the panel, so I've been just thinking about it for a few hours. And what I've been thinking about is the religious pressure to minimize the role of imagination and creativity, which is completely present in Buddhism. No one should be mistaken about it. And in this way, it strikes me that one of the core problems is the divergence of literature from an array of practices that it used to be involved with and inextricably involved with in a complex way. And so we think of literature, as I listen to the different presentations here in the festival and elsewhere, as imaginative, it's potentially fictive, it's creative, it's often very personal, and so forth. And then these practices that used to be in a different domain, they've become trivialized. They've become procedural. There's these how-to instructions. And if I was to tell you that manuals are part of fine literature, you would just be, oh, come on. But no, they absolutely were. They always were. We trivialized that genre of literary output when we trivialized the practices that they evoked and explored and so forth. And so in this context, I just wanted to share 3 thoughts I was thinking about. One is the problem of higher education. So I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, and I think a lot about it. I think higher education is really badly broken. And some of us are trying to think about what would higher education look like if it was reinvented in a different way and took more seriously the issue of the relationship of the broad variety of practices that we do engage in or could engage in with regards to our overly cerebral models of knowledge. And so in that context, we've been doing a lot of things at the University of Virginia, and people often say, isn't that religious? And one of my friends, he's the chair of religious studies, at one point he had this really nice comeback. He said, how do we get to this point where reading is secular and a moment of silence is religious? Yeah? And a second thing, if any of you are familiar with kind of Theravada models of Buddhism, which come from Sri Lanka and Thailand and Burma and so forth, you often hear about how incredible their meditative practices are that are so non-imaginative and non-constructed and just get to the bare bones of reality with insight and calm and so forth. And recently there was a study that showed that in fact, that in many ways that whole rhetoric is a product of colonial pressures. And the dominant form of meditation in these traditions before that was a richly imaginative tradition that involved grammar and literary outputs and using all of these internalized in your body to fashion this internal Buddha, exactly what we're told that they're not up to. So, whoa, that was interesting. And then the third and final thing, I think, has to do with oral forms of knowledge. And so the more I spend time in Tibet and Bhutan looking at oral forms of knowledge, it strikes me how tacit and how deeply communal and deeply contextual the kinds of knowledge are that are transmitted. And when we dismantle them, usually without any kind of intention behind it, there are so many unintended consequences of dismantling them in that way. And so when I hear everybody talking about their books of poetry or fiction or essays or novels and so forth, my mind keeps going back to that other world, a world which is present in many parts of the world where there's this profound creativity that's happening, but it's so deeply embedded in the forms of life of these people at the communal level, and it has economic consequences, values, education, etc. So.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask one more question to all of these gentlemen, and then I'm going to include you in the conversation. I want to pick up, you've said this repeatedly now, the role of the imagination, yeah? And how critical that is to a more creative understanding of how we live in the world, not simply how we exist in it, but how we act in it. So I want to ask the three of you, how do imagination and truth with a capital T relate to each other? Because it seems to me that whatever identity we're searching for, when we're contesting history, we're looking for historical truth. When we're fighting somebody else's religion, we're looking for a religious truth that of course always belongs to us. No religious truth belongs to the other guy, yeah? So if we are going to live more fully and more richly in the imagination or through the imagination, what will that do to our ideas of truth? So would you like to go first, Kalyan?
Well, actually, when we talk about literature and we look at the first literatures, they're all about religion. And we look at, let us say, from Genesis, whether we look at the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, or the Quran, we have some very interesting sort of rhetorical devices at work. Now, you mentioned the grammatology, and I'm thinking of Panini, but I don't want to get to Panini yet. But if you look at the earliest texts, they're declarative. They tell you exactly what happened in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. In the old Hindu texts, there is the oldest of them is the Nasadiya hymn in the Rig Veda. Unfortunately, there are a whole lot of other hymns in the later Vedas, and certainly in the very, very reactionary Puranas that contradict that first of the Vedic hymns. The Nasadiya is a series of questions. It's intensely human. And it exercises that very human quality of asking questions. There are no answers. There is only a series of questions. And it says, who created this universe? Who created all this? What is the purpose of this? Is there good? Is there evil? Where did we come from? Where are we headed? And then it ends up by saying, and whoever knows who has created all this, and did whoever created this world, was he created or she created? It's a neutral gender thing, which is possible in Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit. Did whoever created this world, was that creator created by somebody else and somebody else? Who is it who knows? And that's how it ends. In short, the moment we stop asking questions, we have orthopraxy, we have orthodoxy. So the intellectual underpinnings of any kind of questioning or any kind of examining, once we start to have answers that become hard like cement, we have a problem. We have walls. And this is exactly what has happened in Hinduism itself. This is exactly what has happened in Buddhism also, in the various aspects of Buddhism, between the Theravada and the others. In Islam, in Judaism also, there's a beautiful poem written, I'm getting into Brian's territory, by Solomon ibn Gabirol, who used to live in medieval Spain, a great Jewish poet who wrote in Hebrew. And when death comes, the angel of death comes from Moses, and Moses refuses to go. He loves life too much. And he answers, am I not beloved of God? And he says, but God has asked you to leave. Ask him, ask the prophets, ask this, ask that. Finally, the most human thing, Moses says, get me my mother. And that is extremely moving, because Moses was abandoned by his birth mother. That's the final person that he asks for. It's the human condition. We do not know. We may have been told you're a prophet of God. Ultimately, we are left with, who am I? Who can help us?
Kalyan, I'm going to ask you to
of course.
Just curtail yourself a little bit, because we have just a few more minutes to hear from Brian and David, and then we want to include everybody else. So truth and imagination, Brian, how do they relate to each other?
Well, let me talk a little bit about truth, maybe, because I think truth with a capital T, if we're going to think about truth with a capital T, the first thing we have to resign ourselves to is that there are many simultaneous truths at the same time. And I don't mean that I have a truth and someone else has a truth, but for me, this is what's really interesting, is that, you know, we have the expectation of human beings to be rational creatures, but we're not really rational creatures. And at any one moment, we embody all sorts of different identities simultaneously that lead to different, often conflicting truths with a capital T. And I'll be brief, but I'm glad Kalyan mentioned medieval Spain, because I'll bring it back to medieval Spain and a contemporary of Ibn Gabirol's, who was Shmuel or Ismail bin Nagrilla, and a very interesting historical figure. He was acclaimed as the greatest rabbi of his time. He considered himself to be a Jewish Messiah. At the same time, he was a prime minister for a Muslim-ruled kingdom and a general who led Muslim armies into battle against other Muslim armies. In his spare time, he did what his contemporaries did of his class, which was they held evening-long parties in which they drank wine and extemporized poetry about having sex with slave girls and slave boys. And so, you know, we see as we look at this character how many conflicting identities and conflicting truths that one person can embody at one time. And I think that in terms of not only historical characters, but ourselves, you know, I think we have to be looking at which particular truth we're channeling at any one time and ask ourselves why we are and what the ramifications of that are on the other aspects of our identities.
I like that idea of channeling a truth rather than inhabiting it. You know, very subtle, Brian. Thank you. David?
So I think often we have a false dichotomy when we think about religions in terms of truth being some type of dogma that we adhere to, or some type of deconstructive impulse where we expose them all as equally kind of relative. And you know, Buddhism, probably more so than most religions, really embrace that deconstructive impulse. But for me, the question always becomes, on the other side of radical deconstruction or radical emptiness, we only have one choice, and that's creation. And so the challenge becomes, how do we create? And so in Buddhist literature, you have these two models of creation. One, which is, we heard about the first day of the conference or the festival when the poet read that poem about interdependent origination. That's a negative model of creation. It's not a positive one. And the positive one then is the one that issues forth in how do you create divine worlds, or what we know as mandalas and so forth. And so in that context, I just wanted to mention two brief kind of anecdotes that I think help us think about the relationship of literature and practice, which relates to truth and imagination, and resist this bifurcation, this professionalization of the role of an educator, of a scholar, of a poet, of a novelist that removes us from that rich world that we used to inhabit. So one would be, I've done a lot of work of late in K through 12 education and thinking about how could we bring in tools of empathy cultivation, attention training, et cetera, all of which I think are great. And if we had those in the school system, they would be wonderful. But we would still be lacking something. What we would be lacking is how do we cultivate truth as a model of a rich, ongoing process of world creation across such radical divergences in a multicultural society like so many of us inhabit now. And contemplation won't solve that. That's back to imagination, to truth as a process of world articulation. And finally, one person that I studied with in Tibet, who's since passed away, he was this great visionary who revealed all this extremely imaginative kind of literature. And when I first heard about him, I thought, oh, what an interesting thing, I'm going to go study with the person. And when I finally studied with him and looked at his life and understood what he was doing, I understood he was restitching people's identity back to the world in which they inhabited after the Cultural Revolution that some of us heard about yesterday and Tibetans suffered so terribly during, had torn them away from that world that inhabited a geography, a time, a rich moral universe and so forth. And so literature restitched worlds for people.
Thank you for being so patient. I know you're dying to jump into the conversation. I can hear muttering and fidgeting. So we have about 7 minutes. Please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and somebody will come to you with a microphone, which they're going to take away from me.
Oh, thank you very much. I love what you said, that ignorance easily forms a platform from which to act, and that once God enters the picture, the He, God, as you referred to, never leaves. So my question was, are you referring to the Republican Party?
I think I will be a good guest and not comment on American politics, but there's many things I could say about Indian politics that perhaps would not interest you so much. And of course, I'm so tempted to say that if it was a she-god, maybe she wouldn't be in the picture, you know. But that's, again, that's my ideological position speaking.
Thanks very much. I wanted to find out if you would be willing to entertain the idea of redefining religion.
David, do you want to take that? Because I think that's what you've been talking about in a very focused way.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think a lot of what is happening now in terms of people who are interested, for example, in mindfulness and contemplative practices and yoga and so forth. And we had this meeting a week and a half ago in Germany, this Mind and Life Europe conference, where everybody was there because their intense interest in these kinds of things. And Father Francis Tiso, who's actually a Tibetologist, who's also a Catholic, priest, gave a talk where he basically said, you guys are so excited about this, but you actually systematically dismantled everything about this 200 years ago. And now you're just looking over at Buddhism and India and so forth and thinking that you're going to somehow bring this stuff back together. It's all bundled together. I'm not saying religion in the past was not full of lots of problematic aspects, but if we're going to reimagine a future and just say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. Oh, I'm not spiritual, I'm mindful. Oh, I'm not mindful, I'm just whatever. We're just going to constantly skip and jump over the real problems here, which are deeply rooted. And that's why I would say bring literature back into the world of politics, of economics, of fashioning institutions. That's where it needs to belong, not off in a private place that it got stuck 300 years ago. And we're continuing to enshrine its place there.
I think that's a response also to the Republican Party question. So.
Let me muddy the waters a little when we go to other questions. The matters of faith. If you consider the term auto da fe, acts of faith, then you will shudder to think about what were things done in the name of faith. Perhaps the answer is literature. Perhaps in the final lines in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where he says that the answer is in silence, maybe in writing, in subverting things through writing. That's where the answers might lie.
In the Anglo-European world, we have a 14 to 1700 year problem that we don't address, which is called the Inquisition. Do you think that changed the literary commentary of religion? And if so, how? And what are the books that you would recommend to counteract it?
Wow. Let me just say that I think that the Inquisition is an interesting phenomenon because I think that its importance has been overstated. And I think the reason why it's been overstated is because when we talk about the Inquisition, we're usually referring to the Spanish Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition grew out of, or our view of the Spanish Inquisition grew out of a very particular religious and political climate of the 16th and 17th and 18th century, one in which English historians in particular were interested in vilifying Spain, okay, because it was a rival power. This is how we have the origin of the Black Legend and this idea that Spain isn't really part of Europe. What's interesting is if we look at what the Inquisition was trying to do in its ham-fisted way, was trying to regulate and stabilize a society which was seen to be breaking apart because of heterodoxy. And what was happening in other places simultaneously, and this is the interesting part, are the witch trials. The witch trials, which were not a feature of the lands in which there was the Inquisition. And so what we see is Europe as a whole, I agree with you, grappling with this problem of heterodoxy in two different ways. And on an objective level, I guess, in terms of bodies burnt, the witch craze was actually much worse than the Inquisition. And in that sense, one could see the Inquisition, in fact, as a sort of success. You know? At least that's the uncomfortable conclusion one comes to.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Whoever the mic goes to. But please keep it brief, and we will also respond as briefly as we can. Sorry, Kalyan.
Thank you very much.
Why sorry for me?
The question is actually for Arshia. I was wondering, just kind of when you're talking about your own identifications, if any matters of faith or if any matters of imagination actually kind of inform your personal experience of feminism.
Both. I think feminism is my faith. And I have no I'm not obviously self-conscious about admitting that, though I know that feminism now is quite a bad word. Younger generations of women say, oh, I'm a womanist, I'm not a feminist. You know, I mean, some of us have died for you, just say you're a feminist, yeah? And do I think, do I think that imagination has a role to play in feminism? Absolutely, 300%. Because we're imagining a different and a better world as feminists, yeah? So in terms of identity and imagination, if I had to pick one, I would always go. My first identity is a woman. Everything else comes after that. I really shouldn't have the last word, so we'll have one more question that the gentleman can respond.
My question, I was born in a Muslim family, and I married a Hindu man, and so I was born in Pakistan, married an Indian man, and we have a son. And so what you're talking about is a matter of daily negotiation with, you know, he's 13 now, and we've grown him up to have both a healthy questioning mind, because I don't want him to be dogmatic, and also a reverence and an understanding for both faiths. So we named him Kabir, unsurprisingly. So my question really was, you know, do you think that are there any new paradigms that you see emerging for people like, because in the modern world, I think there are more couples like us, you know, interfaith couples, and they have children, and our central concern is, how do we raise a child with a healthy balance of both questioning and reverence?
I'm also married to a Hindu, yeah. There's many, I don't think it gets any easier to be in an interfaith marriage, certainly not in India. It's getting harder, in fact. But I really don't want to have the last word, so somebody else take this question. How do we raise our children? Brian?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, because I'm in the process of raising 2 children right now. And my wife is from a Catholic background. She's from Spain. I'm from a Protestant background, and neither of us are religious. And one thing that we've wanted to do, though, is we've been afraid that by not being educated in the Bible as a work of literature, that our children are going to lose much of the richness of our culture, even our modern so-called secular culture, which is so deeply imbued with biblical references and perspectives. And so, you know, I think this is the challenge. By throwing out religion, we lose a lot of culture. So how do we bring it in as culture without bringing in the dogma and the rigidity and the orthodoxy? It's a challenge.
Why am I being told this constantly? But, you know, please go ahead.
Say what you want to say. You just have to. Okay.
I'll just say this. Have books in your home that children can pick up and read about. I'm reminded of just one story of my best friend, one of my best friends, M.J. Akbar, who is a Muslim. He's a well-known journalist. His wife is a Hindu. When his son was asked to fill out a form in his school in India, religion, he left it blank because he said, I don't know what religion my son will choose to practice or not practice.